Over to you now.
Hi Kajal, thank you for the short intro. I hope I'm audible. Can
Yes,
you
sir.
just
Yes, sir.
confirm it so that I can begin?
Yes, sir. You're audible to us.
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, welcome everyone. I hope everyone is safe and doing well. It's good to see that people are actually interested in legal topics, and they're so interested that they are available on a weekend, on an evening to attend a webinar. Now, before we begin with the issue at hand or the topic of discussion, it's very important to understand that why is this topic important? That for like it's very important to like before we even proceed that why does a law student need to know about a transaction document? Or let's say even if someone who's a fresher, let's say who has just started his someone who has just started his or her journey as a lawyer, as a corporate lawyer particularly, why does he need to understand, or why does she need to understand or have a basic understanding of the documentation with respect to M&A transaction? So see, there are two reasons. Number one, that there are a lot of things which you will understand in a law school. You would be given enough material to study your curriculum, the literature. That is, there is no end to it. But at the same time, when it comes to practical aspect, you'll have to understand. And to an extent, I do understand it's not possible for law schools to sort of inculcate everything in their curriculum. So you have to understand that there's a huge gap between what you learn in law school and what you actually practice, especially as a corporate lawyer. In litigation, I'm sure that a lot of times you do get to draft petitions, and you do get to go to courts and understand how things work in a court of law. But especially, even if it's the best of the firms, due to confidentiality issues, due to the strict timelines, often interns don't get to draft anything per se. And this, I'm sure that if there are law students attending this webinar, they'll agree to this fact that it's very rare that they do get to draft any document. So even though they do have some bit of idea as to what is a due diligence, some bit of, I'm not saying that they understand, and they do know, like, and some people are huge, like especially law students, even if in their final year, they might be totally clueless as to what is a SHA, what is an SPA, to an extent that they don't even know the full form. So, see, my idea would be not to explain everything in so detail that ultimately someone gets confused. So, my idea of this webinar would be just to at least give some brief background about the documentation involved in an M&A transaction. Obviously, it's not possible to discuss everything in a short span of time, and not just for law students, even people who have just graduated, especially the 2020 batch, or someone who has just started working like 6 months back. Uh, Often I've seen that freshers
Sorry
are
to
totally
interrupt
clueless.
you in
Yeah.
between, sir. Could you please change your camera angle a bit? We could not see a straight version of yours actually.
Do you want me to rotate it
Yes,
upwards?
please. Yes.
Just give me 1 minute. Just give me one
Yeah.
minute. I'll do that. Is it okay now?
Yes, sir. It's fine now.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
No problem. So from that perspective, like even a fresher, when he starts working or when she starts working, people are usually clueless about even the basics of any documentation. And to be very honest, it's not expected that they would be knowing all this. The threshold of, or I would say the expectations from a fresher are really low when it comes to the intricacies of M&A. So at the same time, it's always good to at least have some upper hand over your colleagues or your fellow interns. So from that perspective, it is very important to at least understand the basics of documentation, at least what are the transaction documents involved and what are the key provisions. If not, like obviously some, if you have just graduated or in your law school, no one would expect you to be a master, or no one would should in fact expect you to draft clauses. But it's always good to at least know what any particular document in an M&A transaction entails, or at least what are the basic document and what are the contents of it. Okay, so obviously there are depending on the transaction, uh, an M&A transaction may have an escrow mechanism, which will also involve an escrow agreement, or it may even involve ancillary agreements like employment agreements of employees, etc., etc. Then an M&A transaction may even involve uh, a scheme of merger, demerger. So this list can go on and on. But at the same time, my idea would be to give a basic understanding of at least the simple, or just the some simple agreement like a plain vanilla SPA and an SHA. At least if I'm able to at least inform someone or shed some light on this to an extent that anyone who attends this webinar is able to, at least after the end of the webinar, explain that, look, I have understood the basics of a SHA or a SPA, then I think my purpose would be solved. So now, before we begin and discuss about the transaction documents, it's very important to understand that the first work which an intern, or let's say, if not an intern, a fresher would do would be a due diligence. And at the same time, I've seen a lot of freshers doing due diligence, not understanding why they are doing it. Okay, so it's very important to understand that due diligence is basically finding about the pros and cons of investing in that company. To put it in very simple words, basically, I can say that it's a step taken to understand whether it's legally feasible to invest in that company. Okay, so whatever recommendations you look, or whatever findings do you have, it's not as if someone will just take a decision as to whether or not he has to invest solely based on your report. Just because your report has, let's say, 10 non-compliances pointed out, which the company has not done, just because the company is not compliant with, let's say, 5 minor regulations, or let's say the company has not made a minor filing, doesn't mean that the transaction will not sail through. What will be done is that those recommendations or those pointers will become part of the transaction documents. Okay, I'll be dealing with it in detail as we discuss this, but my idea is to at least give some idea to students, especially who are in their 4th, 5th year, or who have just started interning, and especially to someone who has just graduated. Okay, so idea is not to understand everything at one go. It's impossible to understand the intricacies of an M&A transaction and documentation through a webinar. But rather than paying 20, 30,000 and spending such amount just to understand the basics, is always good to, let's say, Google, get some basic understanding through a webinar, and then Google and educate yourself rather than spending 20, 30K, because I do understand there's so many websites out there who are charging, and I'm not saying that what they're doing is wrong. I would be the last person who would comment on it. But if you think that you can educate yourself and you can learn by reading upon yourself, then I don't think you should spend such a big amount of money. Okay, because at the end of the day, right after you graduate, no one would expect you to start drafting an SP and a SHA as soon as you graduate. It does take some time, maybe 6 months or a year. So now, starting with, let's say, the basic agreement, the most basic agreement, a share purchase agreement. Okay, so as the name suggests, and I'm just assuming that whoever is attending the webinar is totally clueless about all these agreements. So I'll be using very layman words and very simple terminologies, just to ensure that someone who has no understanding at least gets some basic understanding, and based on that, he or she can take it forward and educate himself or herself during internships or during uh, uh, his or her tenure while working with a law firm. Now, starting with a share purchase agreement. So basically, a share purchase agreement documents the understanding between parties with respect to the purchase of shares, as the name suggests. Now, what are the key essentials, or let's say the main, let's say the pointers which go in a share purchase agreement? Because if someone, let's say, asks you what is a share purchase agreement, you cannot just say that, as the name suggests, it deals with the purchase and sale of shares. So ideally, any agreement obviously starts with a definition, with the description of parties, the preamble, then the recitals, then the definition. So I'm not going into all that. I would also only point out the key features, or let's say the what all key clauses will a share purchase agreement have, because obviously it totally depends on a transaction. Let's say if there's, like, if the transaction involves deferred consideration, or there could be net debt adjustment, then it'll totally depend on the kind of transaction it is. But I would explain based on the assumption that it's a very simple share acquisition happening. So a share purchase agreement, ideally, the first aspect which will be covered in such an agreement would be documenting the agreement between the parties. Let's say there are the company has two shareholders, X and Y, and both of them are holding 50% shares each. Okay, and now an acquirer is acquiring 25% shares from both these investors. So at least the first clause should uh, clearly specify that the transaction entails uh, acquisition of so and so number of shares by the investor from so and so parties. Okay, and at the same time, in the first clause itself, you link it to a particular schedule which is annexed to the share purchase agreement, wherein the pre-closing table or the shareholding pattern, because I'm just trying to avoid using technical jargons like cap table, etc. So at least the first clause which deals with the fact that this agreement deals with share and purchase of shares, the first clause will, to put it in simple words, will say that the pre or closing, or basically not pre-closing, the shareholding pattern of the company as on the execution date is so and so. Basically, you will first give the idea that right now, as we are signing this agreement, the shareholding pattern of the company is so and so, wherein X and Y are holding 50% shares each, and the post closing, or basically the shareholding pattern post the acquisition of shares would be so and so, which would reflect, and again it will be a annexure to the share purchase agreement, which would reflect that upon closing post the acquisition of shares, uh, X and Y or A and B would be holding so and so, and a third party, which is the investor or the acquirer, will come into picture. So it should be clearly documented that the shareholding pact as on execution day would be so and so, and on closing day would be so and so. Now it's very important to at least understand what is this execution day, what is closing day, and what's the difference. Because I'll be very honest, when I started working, I had no clue about what is an execution day, what is a closing day, right? I'll be very honest as I discuss. So, see, when you are executing the agreement, when you are agreeing that acquisition of the shares will take place, the date of the agreement could be defined as an execution date. But there could be, let's say, in the due diligence, there are 10 non-compliances. Okay. And these non-compliances are not so material that the investor or the acquirer totally defers the transaction or decides not to go about it. The company is doing really well. It's just that there are minor non-compliances, some registration, some filing which has not been made and which can be made good. So what will the parties decide? That the agreement will be executed on XYZ date. Okay. After execution, by so and so date, you please ensure that all the non-compliances or whatever can be fixed is fixed. And then on so and so date, okay, and then on so and so date, the actual transaction will take place. And by transaction, I mean the shares will be credited, and then the money will be remitted. Okay, so the actual transaction, when it's getting closed, it's getting over, is the closing date. To put it in very simple words for your understanding, execution date is just the signing of the agreement. So there could be a time lag between the execution date and the closing date. Okay, so a lot of times when you're interning or when you just start working, when you're just preparing DD reports, you'll hear these words: execution date, closing date. Your seniors might be using these words, and you might be totally clueless. So execution and closing date do differ, and there could be a situation that execution and closing are taking place on the same day simultaneously, because there are no conditions to be satisfied. So these conditions, which are let's say which come in between, let's say, the signing and closing, or which have to be completed between signing and closing, or before basically closing, are termed as conditions precedent. These are conditions precedent to a closing, which the company or the sellers are under an obligation to complete. Let's say I'm a private company. In during the diligence, it was found that uh, uh, some entries in my register, some statute. Obviously, every company is required to maintain some statutory registers, and it was found that some entries are
missing or they are not in order. Okay, so obviously during your due diligence report, as an associate, or when if you're interning and helping the team, you will obviously you won't recommend in the report which is prepared by the concerned associate, he will recommend that as a condition precedent, the statutory registers should be modified and updated to bring it in compliance with the Companies Act 2013. So now this is not just a like it's not as if this recommendation should just vanish and not be documented, right? Everything should clearly be documented so that the parties are bound to do it. So what you'll do when you are preparing an share purchase agreement, you will pick up this requirement of updating the statutory registers and place it as a CP, which is known as a conditions precedent, okay, which will have to be completed prior to closing. And obviously parties might agree that let's say parties do understand that there is something which cannot be completed by closing, and it is not something very major for which the transaction could suffer. So what they will do is that they will shift that CP at the time of drafting itself. It will not remain as a CP. Instead of putting as a condition precedent, it will become a condition subsequent. Basically, after the transaction closes also, first execution happens, closing happens. And after the closing, that specific requirement or the condition will be satisfied. Maybe the parties are under a hurry to complete the transaction. Then what will they do? They'll not waste time in ensuring that everything is getting completed, every non-compliance has been taken care of. They will in the interest of time, they will shift some CP items as condition subsequent. So this is why often people get confused about what is like, especially juniors, they get confused about, and interns, they don't understand that execution date and closing date are totally like two different words and cannot be used interchangeably, and these are two different concepts. Now, this was about the first clause, which talks about sale and purchase of shares. Now, after that, another important point which is documented in a share purchase agreement would be about the satisfaction of the conditions precedent. I'm just reiterating in brief that there could be certain non-compliances which may have been highlighted in the due diligence report, which should be taken care of. And ideally, everything must be completed between signing and closing, and all those non-compliances should form part of the list of conditions precedent. And how typically it happens is that like let's say, like how would someone come to know that the CP has been satisfied? Another very simple logical question, that let's say it's documented that between signing and closing you'll or prior to closing, these 10 non-compliances have to be taken care of. But how will it be determined that all these conditions have been satisfied? So this is also documented in the share purchase agreement. So ideally, what will be written in the certificate in a share purchase agreement is that once the seller has completed all the conditions precedent, or the company has completed all the conditions precedent, it will issue us confirmation, or basically a certificate, CP satisfaction certificate. Okay, it will send a letter to or the notice, basically. I like using the word notice would be better. A CP notice to the purchaser saying that, look, I was under an obligation to complete all this these conditions prior to closing. I have done it. Okay, and this certificate must have all the basic evidence documenting that, look, I have completed all my CPs. You please check and let me know. So then the purchaser will ideally confirm that, look, I have confirmed, I have checked, it's all, we are good to go. You have completed all your conditions precedent. So the fact about this checking and this notice, and then the seller first issued a CP notice, and then the purchaser confirming completion of these CPs, this is documented in the agreement itself. So this is about satisfaction of the CPs. Now, there could be a situation that there could be a lag between execution and closing date. It's not as if It totally depends upon the commercial understanding of the parties. But obviously, in majority of the transactions, there's a long stop date. It's not as if it's perpetual, that if the CP is not being satisfied, then it'll keep on getting delayed. Usually there's a long stop date, that if the CPs, or if the transaction is not able to sail through by XYZ date, then it'll be all over, and the transaction will be halted or stalled, and it won't be taken forward. So that's how it is. Now, even though I have explained in brief about uh, uh, meaning of execution and closing, now after the CP bit, we'll then capture what happens on closing. Okay, ideally what happens on closing is that parties exchange certificates. Like for example, the purchaser will take a certificate. Basically, the company, the sellers will give a joint certificate saying that there are no material adverse effect which has happened between signing and closing, or there's nothing which there's no breach of any representation warranty, etc., etc. I'll come on the meaning of a rep warranty at a later point of time. So this is a certificate which is given on closing. And then there are, like, if you have to hold some certain board meetings, that happens on execution. Also, there could be a board or shareholders meeting depending on the nature of transaction. All that happens on signing. All that happens on closing also. And then the remittance, etc., or if there are other documents which needs to be exchanged based on the commercial understanding of the parties, that happens on closing. Now, coming about reps and warranties. Now, a lot of times what happens is that same thing. Once you start working, you might be given a reps and warranty schedule to mark up based on two precedents which you have. Your senior might give you a reps and warranties schedule, give you a precedent, and ask you to mark it up, to beef it up. Okay, and obviously, if you're a diligent resource, it'll be easy. It'll take you some time, but you will diligently mark it up. And by marking it up, I mean that obviously, if you have some background of the transaction, you will, to the best of your ability, try to include extra stuff from everywhere possibly you can, which is wrong. But that's how often, in the interest of time, that's how it is done. The junior most person works on it, then someone at mid level reviews it, who has better understanding of the transaction and who knows what he's doing, and who has worked on transaction. Then he reviews it, and then it goes to maybe the partner or whoever he or she is working with. So that's how it's usually done. But the junior most person may be totally clueless that what is the transaction about, what is this rep and warranty which I'm working on. He may understand that, look, I have got a good precedent, and I have to ensure that in a very exhaustive way, I cover everything from that precedent here, and I proofread it. He might do a stellar job, but still he might be, or she might be, totally clueless as to what he or she has exactly done. Now, coming to reps and warranties. So obviously, if you are, let's say, investing in the company, you have, let's say, done a due diligence on it. You engage, like, let's say I'm an investor, I'm our acquirer, I intend to acquire 30% stake in a company. Obviously, I'll engage a good law firm to do the due diligence. Obviously, after the due diligence, that law firm might point out 10, 15 issues with the company which needs to be taken care of. And all that are documented in the agreement. Even then, obviously, the due diligence report depends on the information which the company itself has provided to the law firm. So there is a situation, there is a high possibility that there could be a major non-compliance. Okay, there could be something which even the diligence couldn't catch. So obviously, then that is not highlighted in my documentation in the share purchase agreement. Then my rights are not protected against that. That non-compliance will not be taken care of, obviously. So to take care of such contingencies, and obviously, if I'm investing in a company, I would want to at least need some assurance that everything is in order. I will have an exhaustive schedule on reps and warranties, wherein the company is repping and saying that, look, I'm just giving an example. There are a rep and warranty schedule could run in like 20 pages. I'll just give you some broad heading. Like, for example, see, since I'm discussing rep, I'll just go a step ahead and discuss that rep can be also of two types: fundamental reps and some could be business reps. Like, fundamental reps are something which are very fundamental, basically saying that let's say the seller has authority and capacity to enter into this agreement. The company has authority and capacity to enter into this agreement. They're entering into this agreement will not, let's say, violate any applicable law. These are fundamental reps. And business reps are pertaining to the business of the company. Let's say, for example, and fundamental reps may also include rep on the title of the shares. That look, this is the shareholding pattern. Okay, what I am telling you, this is the shareholding pattern on the execution date. So, other business, like, this was fundamental rep. A business rep can be something like, let's say, writing that the company is in compliance with or material compliance with all applicable laws. The company is in compliance with all labor laws. The company doesn't have any trade unions. The company has adequate assets. The company has adequate insurance policies. The company has like all material licenses required for carrying on its business. So all this is captured in a very exhaustive way in a rep schedule. And rep and warranty schedule is something which is really negotiated, highly negotiated part of a share purchase agreement. So the reason why you are including it, obviously, the reason why you are including it, because you don't know everything about the company as an investor. So the company will rep that as on execution and closing date, this is something which I'm repping. I'm saying that this is true as of the execution date, as of the closing date. But obviously, let's say something like some language like the company is in compliance with applicable law. It is too broad. If it's a company running for, let's say, 10 years, obviously there could be some non-compliance, correct? And if you write that the company is in compliance with applicable law, and if it's forming part of the rep, then obviously you are in breach of the rep, right? So to take care of that, what we include in the SPA is a disclosure schedule. Again, something which as a fresher, when I joined, I was totally clueless about. I just heard about it as an intern, and especially majority of the freshers are totally clueless. Okay, this is not something they'll ever teach you in law school, or if some law school is teaching, then it's really good. But obviously, all this is not taught in law school. So this is a disclosure schedule. So disclosure schedule, what a disclosure schedule is that, let's say a company has made a rep, okay, that the company is in compliance with applicable law, but there are certain non-compliances. Obviously, you cannot, an investor won't let you not include this line in the rep and warranty schedule. He would want you to retain this line, but at the same time, he would want you to prepare a schedule stating that what are those reps against which you want to disclose something, which are not standing true as of that particular date. So let's say, to give a very simple example, let's say the company says that is giving a rep that, look, I'm in compliance of all applicable laws. But at the same time, company knows two things, that let's say some specific labor law related challan has not been submitted. Some specific penalty has not been paid. These are very minor non-compliances, which couldn't form part of, let's say, CP. Okay. So the company will annex all these information as to the best of its knowledge, all type of such non-compliances against this specific rep. There could be a situation wherein, like, this is just one simple example. This is one instance. There could be some other rep on something else, and there could be a breach happening against that rep. And till the time a disclosure is made against that rep, then you are not breaching the agreement, because you are disclosing that, look, I have in the agreement said that let's say there are no labor disputes, but at the same time I do know that there are only these two disputes existing. So rather than deleting the reference of this line of there are no labor disputes, I will disclose against this particular rep in a disclosure schedule that, look, there are actually two labor disputes existing. Okay, so this disclosure schedule, disclosure by the company and the sellers about the affairs of the company, where there is a difference between the affairs as reflected in the representation and warranties. So this slight disconnect, that is taken care of in the disclosure schedule, which is annexed to the SPA ideally
it forms part of the SP as on execution date. The disclosure schedule is dated as of the execution date. And to the extent something is mentioned in the disclosure schedule, that will prevent, like, if, like, let's say the company has idly mentioned that, look, the rep was that I'm in compliance of applicable laws, but in fact I have not maintained XYZ registers. So to that extent, the liability of the company will not exist, because it has already disclosed to you that the company has, let's say, not maintained any particular register. So in relation to the agreement, there is no liability of the company. Let's say basically the purchaser cannot come after the sellers or the company saying that, look, you had told me that that you are in total compliance of applicable laws, and in fact you are not maintaining a particular register. Then you have breached the rep. You please indemnify me. I have suffered a loss in case the investor suffers a loss. So that is taken care of by a disclosure schedule. And ideally, what happens is that on closing also, this disclosure schedule is given by the sellers in the company to the purchaser, which updates the disclosure schedule which you gave on the execution date. It was execution date, because obviously there could be a time lag between the execution date and the closing date. And if a lot of things change, let's say there was some non-compliance which was existing back then, but it has been taken care of, then that will go away. Or let's say some non-compliance is now highlighted, which was not forming part of the disclosure schedule as on the execution date, that will now form part of the updated disclosure schedule. Now, this is about signing, closing, CPs, condition subsequent. I have explained something which cannot be completed before closing, that can be taken care of after closing based on the commercial understanding of the parties. Now, another important point I would want to highlight is that indemnity. Okay, so based on the commercial understanding, one party may, and obviously you all have read about what is indemnity, what is guarantee. It's one of the favorite questions of a recruiter also when you are appearing for an interview. But at the same time, what will help you would be basic understanding of a clause on indemnity. Obviously, that's why you are expected to know the basic concept of an indemnity, how it works. But once you start working, you will be expected to work on such agreements. Let's say when 6 months into the profession. So an indemnity clause, obviously, it's the same what everyone has read in law school. So one party agrees to indemnify the other party in case of any loss, and basically indemnity event are again negotiated basically, and something very standard would be in case one party has breached any rep, warranty, covenant or obligation under the SPA. Let's say to give a very simple example, let's say there was a rep, again I'm giving the simplest example, there was a rep saying that the company has complied with all applicable law, but for a matter of fact there was some huge non-compliance which was hidden from the investor or the acquirer, and the company didn't provide any information in the DD also, which would enable the counsel for the investors to unearth such non-compliance. And then even as part of the disclosure schedule, the company didn't inform the purchaser. Okay, so in that circumstance, in case of any loss, obviously, and provided that it's documented that the indemnified party is the purchaser, and obviously it would be in an SPA, then in that case the purchaser will be able to claim indemnity against the sellers. Okay, so this is about indemnity. And obviously there could be other clauses based on how the drafting is done, or based on the requirements of the client, or based on the transaction structure, but I'm not going to explain anything in detail. Now, moving to the other important document would be a shareholders agreement. Shareholders agreement also similarly, as an intern or as a fresher, you may not have you may not have got any chance to work on it, and it'll take some time on your senior to at least trust you and at least have that comfort that you know the basics, which you, as and when you work on diligences and other stuff, you get to know all this about SPAs and SHAs. It's not as if suddenly you'll learn everything. Just by being in that environment with your seniors, and by working on other small things in bits and pieces, you get a hang of the documentation part also, because your senior or someone at mid-level may take your help in drafting one particular clause.
So this is how you learn. But it's always good to have some basic understanding. Now coming to a shareholders agreement. Shareholders agreement obviously basically uh, regulates the inter se relationship between shareholders. Okay, so I would again explain the basics of any a shareholder agreement, because a shareholder agreement could be a very complex agreement running in maybe 100 page, totally depending upon the transaction structure and the number of parties involved. But I'll just give a brief background of what is a SHA and what all basic clauses which are there in a shareholders agreement. So as I said, shareholders, and now I'm telling you why a shareholders agreement is executed. Let's say there's a company, private company or a public. Let's take example of a private company. It'll be easier. There's a private company. There are 5-6 shareholders. So at least you'll have some. You'll need some documentation, and everyone, someone is holding 30%, 40%, 20%, 10%. That's how the shareholding pattern is. Obviously, you'll need some document to let's say govern the inter se relationship, rights and obligation of the parties, because otherwise if it's not documented, then there could be a dispute. Some party might say that, look, there was an oral agreement between us, you had told me that I would be given special rights, but I have not been given these rights. So it'll be a total chaos if the rights of the parties are not documented. So that's why a SHA is executed. Now SHA, and let's say, and especially if a new investor comes, let's say there were 3-4 investors existing, shareholders existing, you already had a shareholders agreement, okay, in place, and let's say a new person has acquired shares in the company, let's say a 40% stake. Okay, obviously he is not a privy to the document which you guys have entered. Obviously now you will have to execute a fresh shareholders agreement, because by virtue of the fact that this new shareholder or the investor is now there. Now, based on the commercial understanding, the existing SHA will be revised, or based on the commercial understanding, it will be a totally new shareholders agreement. So a shareholders agreement would, the first thing it would capture would be the effective date, that this shareholders agreement would be effective as on the closing date, and the closing date would be the closing of that transaction under the SPA. Okay, because only after that the new shareholder or the acquirer will become a member of the company, correct? And then he'll be bound by the rights and obligations which will be documented in the fresh SHA. So that will govern the effective date. Will write that this agreement will come into effect as on the closing date, but obviously all clauses don't come effect on the closing date, right? The SPA and the SHA both may be executed on the same dates, okay, which will be the execution date, and closing happens under the SPA, and the agreement, the SHA, might also capture that the SHA will come into effect as on the closing date under the SPA. But there are certain clauses like, let's say, confidentiality, governing law dispute resolution. Governing law dispute resolution confidentiality is something which is idly there in all commercial contracts. Even in the SPA, governing law and dispute resolution would be there. I didn't mention it because I'm not discussing each and every detail here. So effective date would capture all that. Then you would have a clause dealing with the board composition. Who would have a board composition? How many directors? Which shareholder will be able to nominate? How entire process of shareholder meeting, board meeting, quorum, all this will be captured based on applicable law, secretarial standards, as well as the commercial understanding of the parties. Okay, and obviously during at the time of closing, even the articles of association will be amended to capture the contents of the shareholder agreement. Okay, not going into details. Now coming to the important aspect, which is very important, would be the share transfer restrictions, because each shareholders agreement usually has certain share transfer restrictions, because obviously you are a shareholder of the company. You wouldn't want the existing shareholder to just sell his or her share to any random person, okay, or you wouldn't want the company to just issue shares to any fresh individual. So if the company is issuing shares, there could be a situation that there's a preemptive clause embedded or forming part of your shareholders agreement. It would mean that, let's say there are 5 shareholders in the company. Okay, 5 shareholders, or basically 5 members in the company. If the company is issuing fresh shares, then the fresh shares would be first offered to the existing shareholders of the company. So this is preemption right. Now, share transfer restrictions. I'm sure that interns, and especially if not interns, especially juniors who just joined law firms, might be hearing these technical jargons: ROFO, ROFR, tag, drag, call, put. Right, like ROFO is right of first refusal, and then that is ROFR. Then ROFO is right of first offer, tag along right, drag along right, call option, put option. So sometimes it's very confusing. Someone who has just started, this is the first thing we Google, right? So to give a very brief idea, like these are just share transfer restrictions. That, let's say, if there are, to give a very simple example, if there are two parties A and B, and let's say party B has a right of first offer, okay, in its favor. So it basically means that if A is transferring shares, then A will have to first offer it to B, okay, and only if B refuses to buy, or if A is able to find someone who, some third buyer who's able to pay more than what B is giving, only then A can sell shares to some third party. This is right of first offer. Now, right of first refusal would basically mean that, let's say there are two parties A and B, okay, and party B has a right of first refusal uh, in its favor. So then A would first find a buyer, get a price, and then give that price to B. Only if B doesn't is not ready to buy the shares at that price, or is not willing, only then you can sell to anyone else. Then similarly, tag right, drag right. Tag basically means that if you sell, tag me along. Drag means that if I'm saying, I'll drag you along. Call and put option. This is very simple concepts. Nothing like, see, it's not, even though the concepts are simple, the clauses might run into like paras and pages. Okay, depending upon the transaction structure. Call option would be right to buy the shares at a future point of time at a predetermined price. Basically, if I have a call option in my favor, put option would be the right to sell the shares at a predetermined price at a particular point of time. So this is about share transfer restrictions. Obviously, the point here is that if I am the investor, I wouldn't want the other investors, or at least I wouldn't want them to at least sell off everything without me having any say, because then there could be a situation wherein everyone has left. They have sold their shares to random people, and I am left, and my shares don't have any market. Because if let's say there are 5 shareholders, 4 of them have sold it to some random people who have very negative reviews, or and other people don't want to negotiate or trade with them, then you will be stuck. Like, you won't be able to, the fifth person will be helpless and won't be able to let's say sell off his stake in that company. So these are the share transfer restrictions in a very simple way, since because we are also running short of time. Then comes certain rights to the shareholders, like affirmative vote matters, AVMs, or the veto matters. Basically this means it is an inter se arrangement between the shareholders, wherein they agree that, look, this is the list. These are the key matters for the working of a company. If the company has to take any decision with respect to these matters, be it in a shareholder meeting, be it in a board meeting, be it in a committee meeting, at least I should have a say in it. If I refuse, then you cannot go ahead with it. So the parties who have like right or a veto right, they can at least ensure that something is go through them. Otherwise, the companies cannot just go ahead and pass that matter, even though that, like, let's say that party is holding a 25% also. Even then, obviously, there could be some matters which don't require any special, or let's say that party is holding 20%. Then obviously there could be some matter which doesn't require, even if it requires a special resolution, investors' consent is not required for passing that matter. Okay, so that investor will try to protect his right by including such a matter in the AVM list. That, look, it is a very important matter for me, for the company, and I would want to have some say over it. So if I don't pass it, if I don't give a vote in its favor, then that matter will not sail through. and like you cannot just pass that matter without my consent. So this is a very important right, which is a affirmative like AVM right or a veto matter, and this is also heavily negotiated, and always there's a back and forth. There could be certain thresholds stipulated. Let's say there's an AVM matter, and some AVM matters I can give an example. One could be amending the MOA or the AOA or the charter documents. One could be taking loan from the company or from some other company, giving of loan, or defending a suit, initiating a litigation, okay, entering into a related party transaction. So what parties would do is that, like, let's say you can grant the other party a AVM matter, but what you will do, you will put a threshold, okay. Let's say that party wants to include that I should have a right over our related party transaction. I should have a right to decide whether or not the company, like whenever the company is entering into a related party transaction, I should have a say in it. What you will do is that you will say that, okay, fine, I will let you have a say in it, but only if the related party transaction exceeds 10 crores. So this is how you negotiate. You one party will try to push for having a right. You may agree, you may disagree, and at the same time you will put a cap on it. So at least to balance your interest as well as the other party's interest. And then there could be clauses like information right. Obviously, if you're an investor, uh, and if you're, let's say, even holding a minority stake, you know that your interest can be marred if you don't have, if you are not having, you may not even be having a say in the AVM matters. There could be a situation. At least as a shareholder, you would want to have some information about the company. So you'll have a exhaustive, you'll have a very big list about information and inspection rights, wherein you'll ensure that the SHA clearly documents that, look, the company will provide so and so information. It could be the financial statements. Whenever it's drafted or audited within X number of days, you'll give me, I'll have an access to the premises of the company, the offices of the company. I'll have an access to the books and records of the company. So all this will form part of the information and inspection rights. So similarly, there are n number of clauses which can be inserted in an SHA depending on the requirement. But it totally depends upon the type of transaction, and also depends upon your client and the opposite side. And similarly, like SP and SHA, there are other agreements also. In case of like, depending on the transaction, there could be an escrow arrangement also, and there are other ancillary agreements also. Like you can, as a CP, or on closing, you may want to revise any specific agreement with a director, or you may execute a agreement for the nominee director you are appointing. So, and there is no end to this discussion. But my idea was to give a very clear and a very simple understanding of the basics of at least the main documents in a acquisition transaction. And for, like, for example, a merger, there could be a merger demerger scheme which you as an associate might be asked to review or prepare. So then there are key concepts like appointed date, effective date. Like, I believe that we can cover it in some next session. But from my side, this was about it. I hope I was able to at least give some basic background and understanding of at least these key documents, which is the SP and the SHA. I'm running short of time, so if you have any questions, I would request Kajal to take them.
Yes, sir, indeed. It was very insightful and a real glimpse of how vast the acquisition and merger process can be and the documentation involved there. But, sir, as you already said about it, like the due diligence process we go across and the company duly diligent themselves, so they come across various information that may be confidential regarding each other. And if by any chance the merger doesn't take place or the acquisition doesn't take place, then the other company is in possession of the credential information, confidential information of the other company. So how does exactly the company deal with such kind of scenario where the acquisition does not take place but they are in possession of information?
Yeah. So ideally, typically what happens is that there's no hard and fast rule, but parties usually enter into a non-disclosure agreement in such cases, even prior to the diligencing of the documents. And it's a very detailed, like, it's not a very detailed agreement, but it will be a agreement which will clearly indicate that whatever information which is being shared is
only for the purpose of the diligence, and the party who's sharing the information will clearly stipulate that look, and also it becomes very important in transactions like for example, there could be a situation wherein the transaction is a bid. Okay, so especially in bid transaction, what happens is that for the same acquisition, there are 10 companies bidding, and the bid is uh, open to all, and basically the DD documents are open to all companies. Okay, and then all such companies or the investors who are proposing to, let's say, acquire or invest, they all do their diligence. So obviously 10 companies are able to see all your documents. So it's very important to in such to take care of such situations. It's always good to execute a non-disclosure agreement, and you'll clearly stipulate in that agreement that look, it will be shared only, like I'm sharing this information only for the purpose of this diligence. Number one. Number two, you will not use this information for your own benefit. Number two, number three, you'll only share information with your representatives and employees on a need to know basis. Number four, you'll you'll ensure that such representatives employees are also bound by similar confidentiality obligations. So even if the transaction doesn't sail through, at least your interests are protected.
Okay. So, sir, like, is there any time period or a limited period of time till when we have to complete the merger acquisition, or it can
No,
go on?
it totally depends upon the, like, it's a commercial point and totally depends on the parties. Like, I can see a question someone is asking, is there any limitation period for the
Yeah.
CP to be completed? So typically it totally depends on the parties. Like, if the parties are in a hurry, and if the non-compliance is something which is not very critical, ideally what happens is that the parties shift it as a condition subsequent, that as rather than completing it before closing, we have this much comfort that we are documenting that look, you will do it post closing, not prior to closing. So if it's a prior, if it's something which is done prior to closing, it's a CP. If it's documented in form of something which is done post closing, it's a condition subsequent, and it's there's no specific time period. And obviously, it has to, if it's a CP, obviously it has to be completed prior to closing. So basically, the closing of transaction usually depends upon satisfaction of the CPs. But obviously, as I said, the usually parties do have a long stop date in mind. It's not as if CPs are not getting completed, and if it's something very critical, some license could be very critical that the entire transaction would hinge on it. So in that case, if the transaction doesn't happen by long stop date, there would be a termination clause in the agreement, and the agreement will automatically terminate. So even if the parties have executed, but just by the virtue of the CPs not being completed by a fixed long stop date, the agreement will terminate.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. It was indeed an insightful session for us, and we came across various practicalities of how the merger and acquisition documentation take place and how long the process can be. I hope that our participants feel the same and they found this session insightful. We look forward to conduct more sessions like that. We thank you for your time and your information you shared with us. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
I inform all the participants that the feedback form link has been provided in the chat section. It will be used for issuing the certificate of the webinar. So please, without fail, fill the feedback form. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, sir, for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.